we can start again, and I welcome back the Australian Energy Market Operator. And I give the call to Senator Pocock.
Thank you very much for your time this morning. It's been good to see the development and implementation of the capacity investment scheme and the exclusion of fossil fuels, given the future that we're facing. Also saw that you found $4.1 billion saving that can flow from distributed and consumer energy resources. The thing that sort of stuck out to me, I was keen to ask you about, was how households and small businesses are not compensated for the value that they can create in producing flexibility of demand through batteries and other means. Do you agree that households and small businesses should be compensated for the value they provide?
Well, let me first just acknowledge the absolutely critical and important role that consumers play in Australia's energy transition. Australia has one of the highest adoption rates of rooftop solar in the world, and that is a very important part of our energy system both today and into the future. As consumers continue to invest in their own resources, both rooftop solar, batteries, electric vehicles and other smart appliances, that's right, the Integrated System Plan did find through its analysis that if those resources are able to participate in the broader market, the whole system will cost $4.1 billion less for consumers. So we would say it's important to find ways for consumers and their devices to participate in the broader system, because that results in lower costs for everyone, not just for those who can afford those devices. Now, in terms of how that gets done, there's obviously some policy questions and some questions around business models for retailers who craft business propositions to get those devices to activate and, sort of respond to market signals, if you like. On the policy side, there's of course the national, what's called the CER roadmap, so the Consumer Energy Resources roadmap. That's a really very helpful roadmap to make sure that we've got the right settings and standards and policy measures in place to make sure that those resources can actively participate in the grid. And the question for what business models exist is, I think it's still relatively immature. I know retailers are developing propositions. There are business models out there for what's called virtual power plants. It would be great to see a broader uptake of those.
Mm-hmm. But that's really useful. But on the principle of it, do you think that consumers, like households, small businesses that either feed in or store and then feed in electrons, should be compensated for them? And we need to find ways to do that.
Well, ultimately, that's a policy question. But what we can say is that the whole energy system costs less when those consumer resources play an active role in our energy market. And I think the way that businesses will try to get those resources active is to compensate consumers for having their resources that they've paid for participate in the market. I think that's inevitable, yes.
And given here in Parliament House, I hear so much rhetoric around cheaper electricity, and out there we know people are genuinely doing it so tough. What are the impediments to actually unlocking billions of dollars worth of savings for households and small businesses?
Well, you're right that consumers are already investing in their own solar panels, increasingly in batteries and electric vehicles. I'd say the main impediment, and I'll ask Merryn to comment on this as well, is it's not the technology. The technology exists. There are probably two main impediments in my mind. One is the right standards and settings, and as I said, the CER roadmap is helpful in progressing towards the right standards and settings for those devices to participate. But then the second is having the right business model for consumers so that consumers can enjoy the value of those devices participating in the broader system. Maren, did you want to add to
just
that?
to add to that and perhaps contextualise that within the preparation of the integrated system plan, one of the things that we do, and we were talking about it before in terms of our inputs, assumptions and scenarios, so we have a range of levels of consumer energy resource adoption, if you like, across our slower, very ambitious and middle pathways to decarbonisation. We assume in the integrated system plan that will be an active participant in the overall delivery for the power system as a whole, and we see it as a fantastic resource, that should be able to contribute. What we've actually done in the integrated system plan is try to highlight the value of that. But as Daniel said, we don't make the policies, we don't set incentives that retailers or aggregators or others would do, but what we can do within the limits of what we can do in the integrated system plan is really highlight the value of that and then provide that information in a transparent way for whoever is going to do that next step.
Mm-hmm. So it's really up to policymakers to unlock this value and put consumers at the forefront of savings.
Our role and what we try to do through the integrated system plan is really highlight the value of that and the importance of having that work effectively in the power system, both from a reliability and security point of view, and provide the advice within what we can do to make sure that that's going to be the outcome.
Okay. And from a day-to-day operations perspective, we obviously manage the system in real time, and rooftop solar can contribute over half of the energy that's needed for the entire national electricity market at times. That's a really good thing, so long as it's effectively managed. And we're also implementing new markets that are developed to enable consumers to be able to participate. So the wholesale demand response market is a new market that AEMO has implemented recently to enable aggregators of these virtual power plants, so not consumers directly but through their retailer, to be able to benefit from engaging with the wholesale market.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's a really good segue to rooftop solar. One of the concerns I have raised with me is that people make these investments. They are generating electrons just like the big power plants, and yet they're having dynamic pricing forced on them without really any notice by some of the retailers, and then at times they're having their feed-in sort of constrained. And I note that back in 2021, in a speech to CEDA, Ms Westman, you said that AEMO and others are developing, and I'll quote, a tiered arrangement that would see rooftop solar constrained only as a last resort. Has AEMO taken any steps to establish a market-based equivalent of the reliability and emergency reserve trader scheme for periods of minimum demand?
Thank you for the question. This is a really important area for us operationally, and of course for consumers who continue to invest in rooftop solar at one of the fastest rates in the world. It's AEMO's role to maintain a secure and reliable power system, and for the vast majority of the time the market does that itself through the dispatch engine. It dispatches the lowest cost energy to meet consumers' needs. At the very ends of those spectrums, so the very, very high demand and the very, very low demand on the main power system, we sometimes need the tools, or rather we need the tools to, as infrequently as possible, intervene in that market. The reliability and emergency reserve trader function that you outlined is one tool that we have for maximising our ability to meet very peak demands, so very high demands on the transmission system when there's peak demands are very high. And there are a number of other tools such as directions and others. It's true that we need to manage times when there is very low demand on the transmission system, and just to bring that to life, in the middle of a sunny day when rooftop solar is providing more than half of the energy in the grid, our requirement is to make sure that the grid is stable and resilient against disturbances. Without sufficient rotating machines on the grid, that can be very difficult. And so while we continue to look for ways to make sure that we can maintain a stable and resilient grid, we also need the ultimate backstop of being able to constrain, or rather ask distribution companies to constrain off rooftop solar, because, as you know, energy needs to be, supply and demand needs to be matched at every point in time. And just while we can't have too much demand for supply, we can't have too much supply for demand. This is something that we never want to use. We never want to interfere with consumers' ability to produce their own electrons and feed that back into the grid. It is only for use in emergency situations after all other tools have been exhausted, such as directions for batteries to soak up those free electrons during the day, bringing back transmission lines to make sure the network can flow those electrons around the network as best we can, and other types of market interventions.
Thank you. I understand the backstop arrangements you're describing, but what about the tiered approach that you outlined in 2021? Is that development? Or?
Yes, it is. And if I just bring us back to, at the top end, we have what's called a lack of reserve framework, which has a 1, 2 and a 3 tiered approach, which enables the market and AEMO to meet consumer needs when there's a lack of reserves or too much demand. We have implemented a minimum system load framework, an MSL framework, 1, 2 and 3 tiered, which has a similar set of tools, a similar set of market notifications and things, that is that tiered framework. It is still in the early days of being implemented, but it is that the minimum system load framework is that tiered framework.
Okay. And so to be clear, there's now a market-based approach.
Well, firstly, the market is the primary method of making sure that we have a secure and reliable power system, and it's through the way the dispatch engine works that we make sure that the power system is secure. Then when we get down to those unusual situations where we have a minimum system load 1, 2 or 3, that tiered framework is about, firstly, an MSL1, minimum system load 1, is a notification to the market. We've got too much electricity, please can you switch on large loads or reduce your generation in the market. And then only in the second stage of that tiered approach does AEMO then start to intervene in the market by doing things like recalling outages or directing batteries to soak up energy. And then the third approach, the third tier, which is one that we obviously seek to avoid, would be the curtailment of rooftop solar to make sure that the system remains secure.
And so if you're sort of looking or moving towards this market-based approach, what sort of opportunity do you see for households in that? You know, as you've mentioned VPPs, but where do you see the sort of democratisation of energy, where households can actually play a role in? There's demand at 5, 6 p.m. and you have a battery, you get paid for that.
Yeah, and look, the best outcome for us as AEMO, as the system and market operator, is consistent with the best outcome for consumers, which is that there's some way for those devices to be able to participate in the entire market. The way that people commonly refer to that is through virtual power plants. So you would, as a consumer, allow your retailer or service provider to control a bit of your battery or your output. You get paid for that as a consumer, and your battery then contributes to that peak load at the end of the day. That market-based solution is still evolving, and the standards and settings that I talked about earlier do need to be in place for those market-based solutions to be prolific, and I think the business model needs a bit of evolution too.
Thank you. And how often has there been curtailment under the third tier of the minimum systems load?
I don't have the exact number of times. I can think of one, which is when South Australia was isolated from the rest of the national electricity market. We had a failure of the interconnector, and essentially just too much generation in South Australia, and we risked a period where too much generation and not enough supply means that the system is insecure and can result in some quite disastrous consequences. We asked the transmission company and distribution company to curtail some rooftop solar in that instance, and they did.
I think the other thing that might be worth mentioning, just to see the process in action, and this is an operational issue, not a planning issue, so, but it's something obviously we talk about at AEMO as our group functions, that the MSL1 was actually issued in Victoria on Grand Final Day, where it was a very sunny day, and there was obviously low load because lots of people were hooked and it was a public holiday, and so that was where MSL1 was issued, but it didn't get to an MSL2, which is that market response in action, where you put out the MSL1 notice and the market looks at that and decides what it's going to do in terms of increasing demand to help to manage that.
One more and then rotate.
So very infrequently, and from our perspective, as infrequently as possible.
Could you maybe just take it on notice and outline, if there's more, some of all of the times that it's been curtailed? Thank you. And just finally, on the solar cut-off mechanism, does AEMO believe that there isn't a need for that solar cut-off mechanism?
Yes, to maintain system security. This is not a tool that we should be using often. The right answer to this is that consumers have their empowered to have their devices participate in the broader system. But at the end of all of the toolkit, it's better to curtail rooftop solar than to switch off entire towns and suburbs that are providing too much energy back into the grid.
And if you do think it's needed, then why haven't you submitted a rule change proposal to the AMC for a standard rule change process?
So one of the things about consumer resources is what's covered under the National Electricity Rules and what's actually covered in jurisdictional regulations. And so households are more, the standards that apply to them, as we understand it, fit more into the state-based regulations. So whether that's safety regulations for households, etc. So the backstop mechanism is not necessarily a good fit into the AEMC process for the National Electricity Rules. It's one of those characteristics of the power system being an end-to-end process where some of it's regulated in state-based regulations and some of it's in the National Electricity Rules. But that might be something worth discussing with the Australian Energy Market Commission.
I'll ask them.
Further.
It sounds like all generators are equal, except some generators are more equal than others. So probably something we'll be turning our attention to. Thank you.
We do. Just on that, though, sorry if you don't mind, Senator, one of the things that we do have for large-scale generators, for example, is very strict technical standards. We have system security arrangements with those large-scale generators such that they need to operate securely on the power system, and so making sure that all supply can maintain system security from an engineering point of view is really important. And so we actually have a piece of technical work with engineers that we're doing to try to make sure that we understand what that technical envelope is, both for the millions of rooftop solar panels, what will be coming in terms of EVs, air conditioning, and how that feeds through into the operation of the power system in the same way that we do with the large-scale generators and storage systems, that we know that we can bring up their engineering department and talk to them about that. We don't kind of have that same framework, and so it is something that we need to work out how are we going to do that, whether that's through Australian standards or other mechanisms to make sure we understand how those plants are going to operate in the power system as there becomes more and more of them.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I flag I'll have some more questions on that later on. Also flagging that with your concurrence, we'll keep AEMO on as a witness until we go to a lunch break at 1 p.m. And future witnesses will be pushed back commensurately. Deputy Chair, questions?
Now, you work with CSIRO on their GenCross report, that's correct? Yep. What does that report tell us about costs of building new power generation?
Yeah, so one of the thank you, Senator. One of the things that's really important in terms of the inputs that we get to prepare the ISP and do the economic assessment is obviously cost inputs for the range of things that we'll be considering. So on the generation side, we need to get information around the cost of generation, and that's not just the cost of generation now, but what will be the future cost of generation. And so when the ISP was first started, we had to generate that information, and so we partnered with the CSIRO in what has become the GenCost report. Our part in that is that we engage an external consultant, and that varies who that is, to actually canvass what the cost of projects currently is for the different technologies. And we then, CSIRO, take that information and help us by developing what is the future cost of that going to be. So solar and wind in particular and batteries are forecast to reduce over time. So we ask them to provide us with a range of what will be that future cost from today's cost, as to how that will vary across a range of scenarios so that we can take that into account. And that is the key thing that we use as an input into the integrated system plan cost-benefit analysis. GenCost in its evolution and some of the things that the CSIRO put into that, which are not used in the ISP, is a broader range of things that they've developed and consulted on the methodologies on, but they're still all put into the GenCost report.
Cool. As the system stands currently, coal provides a level of baseload power, is that correct?
Yes.
What is the projection for that over time? So we know that coal's retiring. What's the percentage looking like into the future?
Let me just first tackle the word baseload,
Okay.
and then
Sure.
that's why you saw a little hesitation there.
It's like,
And then where we are today, and then into the future.
Okay.
So historically, coal has provided baseload energy, and by baseload, that typically means on as much as possible. It's the lowest cost, and so the way our market operates is that the lowest cost is dispatched first. Historically, that's always been coal, and so that's why it's been always on. Moving forward,
so baseload means lowest cost.
it's a confusing term.
Yeah, because I'm not sure I'd ever really interpreted it as that. More as so, yeah, can you unpack that a little further?
Yeah, so baseload historically has meant always on generation. At being always on and with very low marginal cost of production, it has been the lowest cost of production for electricity to meet consumers' needs. Increasingly, what we're seeing is that baseload is not actually the lowest cost. So, for example, during the middle of the day, baseload coal is switching down and would switch down further if it could to accommodate for zero marginal cost renewables that are coming into the system, be that solar or wind. So the concept of, I've described the old paradigm of baseload to meet the lowest level of energy needs, and then peaking plant to meet those peak periods of time in the afternoon and evening. That paradigm is shifting to renewables being the lowest cost, and firming. And that firming is absolutely critical, and it's to meet the difference between the lowest cost supply and demand. But that firming will come from increasingly battery storage, pumped hydro, and flexible gas generation as the power system evolves. So that's the concept of baseload and firming through to renewables baseload and peaking through to renewables and firming. Now, to answer your question on coal, so coal, which has historically been the mainstay of Australia's power production, over the last 12 months has provided around 55% of energy needs in the national electricity market, about 5% from gas and about 40% from renewable energy. Over time, that's obviously decreasing. In the last decade, we've seen 12 coal-fired power stations retire over the last decade, and that is obviously forecast to continue. The rate at which
that 12 coal-fired
power stations, yeah. The rate at which that continues is up to investors. The owners of those power stations, which are old, and both coal and gas and oil power stations as well, when they retire from the market is really up to them.
It's not being driven by your policies or government policies, it's being driven by...
We're not driving it. The decision to close is the asset owner's decision. It's not our decision. What they need to do with AEMO is to provide us with 3.5 years' notice of that closure. But when that plant closes is the decision of the asset owner. Going forward, there are, of course, different projections about when these old plants, both coal and oil and gas, will close. To provide two data points on that, the first would be the Integrated System Plan, which says that to meet Australia's emissions targets on the way to net zero, then 90% of all coal-fired power stations are expected to close in the next decade. That's a forecast based on what is required to meet Australia's emissions targets. A different data point would be, well, when have coal-fired power stations or oil and gas power stations notified us that they're going to close? That's also public. It's on our Gen info file. It's on our website as well, which provides dates by which asset owners have nominated when they're going to close.
So you don't tell them that?
We don't tell them that. They tell us.
Plans are.
They're not binding. The only thing that they are required to do is to give us 3.5 years' notice. So while they provide an indication of when they expect that plant to close, it's not binding.
Okay, so in the next 10 years, you're saying that 90% of that generation will be gone.
No. So what the Integrated System Plan shows is that if Australia is to meet the emissions targets that are set by governments around the country, then 90% of coal-fired power stations would need to close for that plan to deliver against targets. That is different to, firstly, what asset owners are currently telling us, which is, again, publicly available on our website, and likely to be different from actual reality, because asset owners are the ones who are making those decisions, not AEMO.
So sometimes they bring it forward, sometimes they push it back, depending on their circumstances.
Eraring is a good example of that. Obviously, the latest announced date for the closure of the Eraring power station in New South Wales is 2027. Prior to that date being 2027, it was 2025, and prior to that date, it was 2032. So these dates do change around a little bit.
Backwards and forwards.
Backwards and forwards. Yeah.
Okay. And so your projections of the base load going forward, what's your sort of 10-year projection then of what that's going to look like?
We don't project base load. What we project is what's required for a secure and reliable power system to meet the needs of energy consumers using the lowest cost energy available while meeting government targets going forward. The term baseload can be quite confusing, and that's why I'm avoiding using it. We don't forecast baseload, or we don't use that in our forecasting.
So essentially, when the system was all majority coal, it just ran all the time, and that's fine. But now going to a renewables scenario where you've got hydro, where you've got wind, where you've got solar, the system is changing.
It's fundamentally changing, and the power plants that used to run 100% of the time are finding that in the middle of the day, what they need to do is to ramp down to their absolute minimum generation. And in fact, one or two of the coal plants are finding ways to switch off in the middle of the day because that's the most economic answer for consumers. So the way our system is changing with this, with a higher and higher degree of variable renewable energy, is quite fundamental.
And Senator, just to add to Daniel's evidence, I think from the way that we see our planning function and our integrated system plan report progressing, what we have is a current system where coal is the dominant source of energy and baseload is a key issue. But as we transition to a renewable grid with an increasing amount of renewables, baseload is something that we don't need as much. We use firming and we use gas. So I think maybe what you're trying to ask a little bit about is there a role? How do you get baseload in a renewable system, or do you need it?
Yes, trying to sort of unpack those terms and what that actually means in terms, as we move forward.
Yeah, and perhaps just to bring to life a day or a week in the 2040s. In the integrated system plan doesn't have any always-on generation. It doesn't have if you like, variable renewable energy is the new baseload because it is the lowest cost to consumers. That's obviously variable. And what's needed is storage in terms of batteries and pumped hydro to smooth out the peaks and to fill in the troughs from that variable renewable energy. And there will be times when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow for extended periods, and Australia needs flexible gas generation to be able to provide that firming generation for the extended periods, most likely in the winter, when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow for periods.
Right, okay. I do have more questions. I'm probably going to have to put them on notice because I have to share the call, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chair.
Senator Canavan.
Look, thanks very much, Chair. It's a very good segue to my next line of questioning, which was about this issue. So my takeaway of what's just been said or revealed by Senator Grogan's questioning is that the conclusion that 90% of coal-fired power stations will shut in the next decade or so, that is being driven by government policy decisions, not the economics of coal-fired power stations.
I'd also say it's not a conclusion. It's the integrated system plan projects that in the most likely scenario, as per the way the integrated system plan is developed, to meet Australia's emissions targets, then 90% of coal-fired power stations are expected to close.
To shut. Yeah, and so I think again going back to where I started today, and I think Senator Grogan could kind of understandably, I think, was under this impression. I think a lot of people out there, the impression is that your planning has projected that the economics of coal is no good and therefore they'll have to shut in the next 10 years. That's not a conclusion you can make from your modelling then.
That's not a conclusion from this modelling. Obviously, you would speak to asset owners and they'll probably tell you what they tell me, which is that it is harder and harder to operate these plants and that they're getting old and increasingly they require maintenance and upgrades to be able to be as flexible as possible. So asset owners are telling us that the coal-fired power stations are closing. It's a matter of when.
But their closure dates are beyond what you project based on government policy settings.
There is a difference between what asset owners are telling us and what the integrated system plan projects, and that varies on a case-by-case basis.
Well, but if I look at a graph here, I had it up before, this is figure 1, I think, from the 2024 ISP, so it's probably pretty soon in the report. The announced retirements dashed line is beyond your bar graph that has it. So in general terms, you have projected earlier retirement of coal-fired power stations than what's been announced by the generators or owners. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. Right. And we do see that those announcements get brought ahead. So you would also see on that chart that there's a dashed line from the previous integrated system plan, the 2022 ISP, and the 24 ISP announced line is lower because asset owners have told us that they're closing their plants earlier.
That's out beyond that. That only happens after 2035. So I'd probably discount what people say they're going to do in 10 years' time. And likewise, it cuts both ways. Obviously, Eraring has been pushed out further than previously announced.
Well, Eraring, I think at the 2022 ISP was their announced closure date was 2032.
Right. So, but it was going to be closed in 2025, I think, wasn't it?
Well, it was first. It was.
Okay. But there was an announcement that it would be shut. I think Ms York is confirming that.
There was a time there.
So
when
there's swings and roundabouts here. So getting back to this point, if we are going to meet our targets, our emissions targets, that will cause coal-fired power stations to close earlier than they otherwise would, based on the projections or plans of the owners of those stations.
Well, the date for closure of each asset is a decision for the asset owner, not for us.
But how are we going to meet our targets if they stay open?
Well, that's a question for policymakers.
Yeah. So there's no guarantee that the government's, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but there isn't really at the moment a direct mechanism to force a coal-fired power station to shut. Is that? No.
Not that I'm aware of.
No. So if they're still making money and want to stay open, they obviously think they're going to be making money for longer than your projections say. Where we're not going to meet our emissions targets, are we? If they don't shut by the dates you're suggesting?
Well, again, what the integrated system plan shows is what's required to meet government targets.
Yeah. So there's a gap currently in the current plans. Again, I suppose we've kind of gone over this, but you don't have any modelling of what the costs would be if the retirements of coal-fired plants stuck to the announced retirements pathway. You don't then generate, well, this is what it would cost to consumers or cost to the overall running of the electricity grid. No, they don't do that at all. Okay, all right. I just wanted to go back. You were quoted, Mr Westerman, in July of 2022 saying that, and I direct quote in an article in Renew Economy, that we know that we're likely to see 60% of today's coal generation gone by the end of the decade. And you go and say, so in fact, these recent energy events, that's in brackets, I'm not sure if you said that, but so in fact these events have simply underscored the need to accelerate Australia's energy transition to the cheapest form of reliable electricity. So on what basis were you saying that 60% of coal generation would be retired by the end of the decade?
I can't recall the exact quote. I believe that it would be reported. We maintain two sort of sets of coal closure dates. One is what's required by the integrated system plan. One is the announced retirement dates. Those announced retirement dates we do use in our analysis of the electricity statement of opportunities reports. So these are the sets of analyses that basically show what investment is required to make sure that Australian consumers have access to reliable and secure electricity over the decade ahead. I don't have my notes from the time, but potentially I was reflecting the dates that are given to us that then go into the ESOO analysis.
Well, perhaps you could take that on notice, because at least when I look at the figures, I think the 60% figure you're using there is from the ISP. So if that were true, you couldn't conclude that would be gone by the decade, could you? Because as you've said all morning, these are just projections, they're not actual outcomes, even predicted outcomes.
I think I'd go one step further, which is that even if we were using the announced dates that are given to us, they're not set in concrete either.
Yeah. Of course. But could you take on notice where you got the 60% figure from in July 2022?
I can.
Yeah, thank you. You also make another claim in that statement that I read out, that we have to accelerate Australia's transition to the cheapest form of reliable electricity. I mean, we've just spent the whole morning, and you've been at pains to say to us that you do not model the cheapest form of electricity, you model the least cost way of getting to particular targets. So on what basis did you tell all of Australians that that we need to transition to a cheaper form of electricity? How did you come to that conclusion?
The winter of 2022 was a very difficult time for all consumers and many in the industry. That was the time when we had a coincident period where there was a lot of coal-fired power station outages, high prices for gas, a wind and solar shortfall, and high demands. That led to a very challenging time in operating the system and a real need for all of the power stations that were available to maximise their output into the market. What became pretty evident in that period of time were that the power stations that we were relying on to supply electricity to Australian consumers weren't there when we needed them. And what I was told by asset owners is that these coal-fired power stations, in the majority, were old. They needed maintenance, and like an old car, they break down sometimes.
Yeah, exactly right.
And my reference there would be to, as has been AEMO's consistent message, that investment is needed in generation, in storage and in transmission to make sure that consumers continue to have access to secure and reliable electricity at the lowest cost possible.
Not sure you've answered my question, though. You left the impression for people, like any reasonable person hearing this, because you say, and I didn't say the next sentence, I'll say that now, you said it's these events, and you've gone through them, I well remember it too, in the winter of 22, these events have simply underscored the need to accelerate Australia's transition to the cheapest form of reliable electricity, and that is firmed renewable energy. I don't think anything in your answer has confirmed to me why and how you could make that conclusion, given all morning you've told us that your work, your modelling, does not actually answer that question. It simply answers the question of, if we are to install 82% renewables, what's the least cost way to it? It doesn't evaluate the difference between, for example, of going to 82% renewables and rebuilding those coal-fired power stations. Yes, they're old, but of course they could be rebuilt and we could have new ones. How did you conclude that firmed renewable energy was the cheapest form of electricity?
The modelling that we do for the Integrated System Plan shows that the lowest cost replacement for coal-fired power stations that are retiring is renewable energy firmed by batteries, pumped hydro, and ultimately backed up by flexible gas power generation.
Right. Well, look, Chair's moving me on, but the core problem, I think, here is that you are talking out of both sides of your mouth. You are making clear statements like this in the media that cause people like Senator Grogan to take a very different conclusion from your work than you've gone through this morning in detail to us. Your work does not do a cost-benefit analysis of net zero emissions. It does not do a cost-benefit analysis of 82% renewables. It does not answer the question that most Australians want the answer to of what is the least cost way of producing electricity to them. Yet you make statements like this which suggest to any reasonable person that you are actually doing that work when you are not. So I think that has contributed to the great confusion that's out there about why this country can't seem to deliver cheap electricity. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Canavan. I guess sticking on a theme, but more looking at how we do, what sort of mechanism or approach should we be taking to get carbon out of our electricity system? It seems to me and others that if we are to decarbonise the NEM, it's simply a matter of displacing coal. And as you say, there's no formal trigger to be able to do that. It will depend on economics. So therefore, an economics approach to this problem is going to be the solution. Currently, most days, wholesale energy prices are zero or negative during the middle of the day. Is that correct?
For the last quarter, around 20% of dispatch intervals have been negative, and that is broadly during the middle of the day, yes.
And this is an incredibly powerful force in the NEM, in that it's doing a number of things. One, it's putting downward pressure on coal-fired stations to be able to how much they can operate, and therefore their economics is pushing down. The glut is largely driven by rooftop solar, which can't be curtailed unless you go through the process of what you were talking about earlier. Utility scale solar and wind out in the regions can be curtailed, so they're protecting themselves from those low prices, which has two effects. One, it's that VRE is not putting the downward pressure on energy prices that they've long promised. Would you agree with that?
There's many aspects to that question. I certainly agree that during the middle of the day, an abundance of renewable energy is lowering output from coal. It is seeing lower prices during the day, and yes, that we are seeing large-scale renewable generators, both wind and solar, responding to those negative prices in the middle of the day by curtailing their output. Whether or not that has an impact on the average wholesale market price or forward prices, I can't comment on.
Okay. Given that that economic problem plus the supply problem that coal mainly stays in the market because being baseload or dispatchable, it has the ability to be able to serve energy into the market when it's higher prices. So that offsets its the economic negatives during the middle of the day. In order to get rid of coal, surely the solutions aren't just more renewables, but it's more storage that can take the place of coal later in the day. So when solar and wind aren't contributing as much as they need to, storage can contribute. Yet I note in the ISP, all actionable projects are all transmission. You don't make actionable projects such as storage, such as more renewables. It seems to me that is there either a bias towards transmission, or is the reason why you can't make actionable storage projects, whether batteries or FAIRs or whatever it happens to be, such that you're starting to solve for the things that are going to displace coal out of the market sooner rather than later?
I'll just say one thing and then I'll ask Merryn to comment on the ISP. The aim of the ISP and the aim of AEMO is not to displace coal. The aim of AEMO is to make sure that Australians continue to have access to secure, reliable electricity at the lowest price they can. And that's our operational role. It's also our planning role. Through the constraints that are in the integrated system plan, as we've spoken about at length this morning, that necessarily sees a decline in coal, and that is consistent with asset owners telling us that these plants are old and retiring. Now, to the point about a large amount of storage, that's absolutely right. A large amount of storage is absolutely required for that firming role, and perhaps I'll just get Merryn to unpack that a bit.
Sorry, before you go on, just pick you up on one bit. You say emissions reduction isn't part of your remit. The national energy rules that include the national energy objectives say that emissions targets are are one of the drivers of what you need to do and should be doing. This might be for Ms York as well because it's ISP. I'm intrigued as to why the ISP uses in all its scenarios an 82% renewable target instead of an emissions reduction target. That seems to skew the outcomes to me.
And if I can just clarify one thing before I ask Merryn to clarify that. My words were that it is not AEMO's objective to exit coal. Yes, the National Energy Objective requires AEMO to consider the emissions targets of all jurisdictions, and of course we do that. It plays a much larger role in the planning function.
So to again pick you up on that, how does AEMO and the NEM meet an emissions reduction target without displacing coal?
I'm not sure I understand the questions.
Well, you can. The majority of the carbon that's in the NEM is coal-fired generation, correct?
Oh, right. Okay. So, if I can clarify, the objective of the integrated system plan is to meet all government targets while reliably and securely supplying electricity to consumers on the way to net zero by 2050. What happens as a result of that? We are technology agnostic. But yes, it needs to meet emissions targets on the way through. It happens that coal-fired generation is one of the highest forms of emissions intensity in the grid, and that is what falls out through the modelling. But it's not through a predisposition against coal-fired generators.
But I'm not saying you're negatively disposed, but you do have an obligation to reduce emissions. And the only way to do that in the NEM is for coal to be either ordered out, incentivised to leave, or the economics of it don't stack up for the plant owners and they choose to exit.
Our obligation is to consider the objectives, the emissions objectives of each of the jurisdictions in the national electricity market in our planning function, and that's the way the integrated system plan comes together.
Again, I go back to why then in the ISP do you use as the baseline for all the three scenarios as an 82% renewables target versus an emissions reduction target?
So the truth is we do both. And do you want to just unpack that?
Yeah, you've asked a number of questions about actionability, about emissions targets, and about how we work through that, I think, in the planning function specifically as opposed to the dispatch function, which is kind of real-time dispatch at the time. So I'll just stick to the planning function, maybe going to actionability first and why actionable projects are transmission projects. So the framework that's set out in the National Electricity Rules really applies to an actionable project is something that has a proponent that can do a project assessment draft report. So the way the rules are actually written is that from the time we make it actionable in the ISP, there's an obligation to prepare a PADA within 12 months. And so the obvious implication of that is that the need has to be addressed either by a network or non-network solution. So as part of that RIT-T process that we were discussing before, the TNSP may find that batteries or some other form of non-network solution could be the actual solution to that identified need. So that could come out of that process, but it is not something that we could make generation actionable, for example. That's not part of the framework that's set out in the rules that we could say, well, a generator needs to go here to be an actionable project because there's no one to produce a PADA for a generator. That would only come out of the RIT-T process as a non-network solution to that identified need.
I'll come back to that if I can. It just seems there's a skew in the ISP, not only towards transmission. Now, and I'll separate that out into two sorts of transmission. Transmission in the actual projects that, for example, build infrastructure to connect up the various reses that have been designated around the country. That seems to make economic sense to me. However, the large-scale interconnectors, VNI West, HumeLink, Marinus, etc., I don't understand the economics behind them. They connecting various regions across the country is their intent. Yet there is no generation price differential in those regions. It costs just as much to build or fuel a wind farm or a solar farm in most countries. Yes, there are some capacity factor differences, but certainly not enough to justify the high cost of interconnection. There's no temporal spread in terms of, the NEM effectively, runs north-south, so there's no time difference, as in, a more western district could be supplying the east coast as it goes into dark. There just doesn't seem to be any economic justification for these projects when they come at an opportunity cost to be able to fund other things such as connect out more reses, more battery storage or pumped hydro storage. There seems to be a real loss of opportunity cost there.
So the way in which the Integrated System Plan evaluates transmission, and before I talk about that, the way in which the ISP is developed in the actionability framework is specifically about what is the solution to identified needs going through the next stage, which is really regulated transmission. And that is a difference between generation development, which is investor-led and market-based, and transmission, which is that monopoly service which is regulated under the economic regulatory framework administered by the AER. So that is a difference, and that flows through to the way in which the rules are written. So when they evaluate that when we evaluate that in the ISP, what we do is using the cost-benefit assessment analysis guideline that's set out for the things that are within the national electricity rules, there's criteria and arrangements that can be considered in that. We actually compare the integrated system plan development path, the various ones of them initially, and then obviously the one we publish is the optimal development path, with and without the proposed transmission. So all of the existing and committed and anticipated transmission is included. We remove all actionable and future transmission projects and work out how we would meet the objectives. So the emissions reduction objectives, the 82% renewable, all the other things that are in the target statement and the policies that are included, how would we meet that in the absence of that future transmission, both actionable and future projects? Take those out. And what we find is that there would be a lot more generation, storage, other types of infrastructure required. And then we're really looking at the difference between those capital costs, operating costs, etc. So what we find is that the transmission annualised cost from now till 2050 is $16 billion. If we go to the counterfactual and look at what are the other costs that would be incurred, we find that that counterfactual would have higher costs of the $16 billion plus another $18.5 billion of additional costs that would otherwise be incurred to reach those targets. So it's really a cost-benefit analysis that it's net beneficial overall to share that resource and avoid the additional capital cost, operating costs and other costs associated with that counterfactual where you don't have any of that transmission.
I wish I had some more time to debate you on that, because I've got a lot of questions about your approach to cost-benefit analysis. But suffice to say that it would seem to most people that there is a lot more benefit out of, and you'll drive more renewables and more storage by facilitating connection to reses and supporting their infrastructure than interstate connection, which delivers no economic benefit because there's no differences in time, geography, or cost.
I think both are required. It's not a one or the other. Connections to renewable energy zones are required. Generators need to be able to connect, but there are definitively benefits that are associated with each of the large-scale transmission or interconnected projects that are shown in the Integrated System Plan, and each one is shown in the ISP.
You might want to put that on notice to me, and I'll put some questions to you on notice to come back to me on that, because I can't see those arguments that can't be met in better ways, particularly at the absolute enormous cost of those, plus all the question marks that exist, over how those projects have come to be developed and the cost blowouts that have happened right through that process. But I'll leave it there.
Would you like to go back to the emissions and 82% renewable? Do you have time for that?
I think I need to share the call, to be fair.
Perhaps the short answer is that it is both, as Daniel said. So all of the targets that are set out in the AEMC's target statement, which includes emissions reductions, for example, on the Commonwealth, 43% below 2005 levels by 2030. That's included renewable energy target of 33,000 gigawatt hours, which has already been achieved. Commitment to 82% renewables. The point, Ms. York, was that the ISP only models across all three scenarios 82%. It actually meets all of these, and the modelling includes those as an input, and so the modelling will deliver all of those targets. But 82% renewables doesn't necessarily equal 43% emissions reduction.
No, but it's a government policy that's in the target statement as released by the AEMC, the Commission. So that's why it's in all of the different scenarios.
But the rules say that the objective itself, number 3, says emissions reductions.
Well, that might be a question for the Commission, but in the target statement that we need to take.
I know it's in the target statement, but I'm referring to what's in the NEOs. Anyway, I'll pass the call to Senator Pocock.
Thank you, Chair. I know we're running up on time, so I might just ask more questions about curtailment of rooftop solar, and then put a bunch on notice. Ms. York, in your previous answer, you said that state-based regulation was more appropriate for solar cut-offs than the national electricity rules. Have you received legal advice to that effect?
I have not personally, but that is something that I'm not sure, Daniel, whether we have legal advice, but that's something that we have been discussing in terms of those regulations.
The regulations for consumer energy resources broadly are in state-based. Whether they should be in national or should be in state is a question for policymakers, but that they broadly are in state-based regulatory frameworks at the moment. That's why the national CER roadmap is really important, to try and get harmonisation across the different jurisdictions for things like disturbance, ride-through, the right settings, so that, as Merryn said earlier, these resources can participate actively and confidently to a secure and reliable power system.
Given you're saying they broadly are, maybe if you can take a notice, if you have a copy of the advice or legal advice that was given to say that this is definitely under the purview of the states, rather than being able to...
I think what we can come back with is our understanding of the regulations and laws that consumer energy resources adhere to, and how that's cut by jurisdiction versus the national rules.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that there was actually no legal advice to really decisively know that, okay, this is actually not something we can regulate?
I don't have any legal advice. And maybe if I can understand the genesis of the question a little bit more.
Well, you're saying it's complicated, a little bit convoluted maybe, to work out what is state-based regulation versus the national electricity rules, and we've talked about just how critical demand side is, and yet you haven't actually sought clarification on, okay, this is something that we can't touch, or maybe this could actually fall under our purview.
Well, we work through that actively with the Ministerial Council, and the outworkings of that are really the National CER Roadmap, which does try to harmonise the standards and settings and regulations upon which those consumer devices, batteries, solar panels and EVs and others adhere to. The answer to harmonisation that the Ministerial Council have announced is through that CER roadmap.
Mm-hmm. Is there advice from the Ministerial Council about whether or not you can make rules about solar cut-offs, or if it's...
Perhaps we can consider where it has been implemented, which is in South Australia. So an example is that has been implemented through more state-based regulation. So whether that applies in all jurisdictions, as Daniel said.
But you're not sure.
We don't have formal legal advice on that, but we can take it on notice as to what input we've had regarding that. Perhaps.
I mean, to be clear, Senator, I appreciate a lot of the inquiries about what our role and function is, and we're the operator, and so the questions about setting the rules and setting the policy frameworks are really ones for the energy departments and the ministers through the Ministerial Council, and we operate within that framework. So even if there was legal advice, we wouldn't really know if there was or wasn't. That's really a policy question.
If there was legal advice, you wouldn't...
Not as the operator, no.
...be able to do anything?
Well, it's not something that as the operator we would generally get involved in. That's really something for a policy question for the policy development that's done through the Ministerial Council in each of the state energy departments and the federal energy department.
Sure, but you also chose not to propose a rule change to the AEMC on something that's happening, and my understanding of this is that there would usually be submission of a rule change so that you can do this curtailment. So I'm just trying to work out, like, it doesn't quite line up with what you're saying.
Yeah, so we haven't submitted a rule change to give ourselves the ability to curtail rooftop solar. That's true. The ability to do that is generally a state-based ability. I don't have legal advice on that. That's just my knowledge of the electricity system that we operate within. The way that we've chosen to bring that together, noting that the Commission is the rule maker for the national electricity rules, it would need to coordinate the different state jurisdictions and their own standards, settings and consumer frameworks. The way that we've chosen to lean into that is through the Council of Officials and the Ministerial Council through this National CER roadmap. And we do see that as a very productive step forward in the harmonisation of standards and settings that does achieve certainly the objectives that the operator has in gaining confidence in these devices.
Okay. I guess in my mind, representing people in the ACT, this seems exactly the reason there are some concerns around transparency. And if there's not the public process of going through AEMC, how are Australians supposed to know and have faith that consumers are getting value for money?
Yeah, I think it's a challenging question when you get to the consumer end. One of the reasons for that is that the national electricity rules don't necessarily extend into people's homes, and rightly or wrongly, that's the way it is. Things like energy efficiency, the performance of smart devices, air conditioners, fridges, those sorts of things, these are not regulated under the national electricity rules, and they are typically done at a state-based level.
Thank you. That's helpful. You talked about the risks to the system if there isn't some sort of solar cut-off mechanism. I'm wondering if you've done a risk and probability analysis in relation to the solar cut-off mechanism.
Yeah, so actually, do you want to talk about the work that's that work?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that we are working on and thinking about from an engineering point of view and the technical operation of the power system is the minimum system load that was discussed before. So what we know is when we have low levels of demand being supplied at transmission level, that there is, we have a need for power system security elements which currently are being primarily delivered from synchronous plant. We need to have a minimum level of some of those things, and the things I'm referring to are things like fault current, which helps protection systems which isolate parts of the network when there's faults on them. So they're absolutely essential. We need voltage management. We need system strength provision, which is really trying to make sure that everything retains synchronism together. We need frequency control, and we also need to have enough capacity on the network to ensure that if there is what we refer to as a contingency, that a fault where a part of the power system's isolated, that we can land in a secure state. So we need to make sure that we can have the confidence that the power system will hold together, if you like. And so at the moment, a lot of those services are provided by synchronous plant. In the future, we are working very hard to make sure that we can consider other technologies, and particularly inverter-based technologies with new control systems that will be able to provide some of those services in the future. But at the moment, we need to make sure we've got enough synchronous plant connected on the system at all times so that that power system security can be maintained. And that means we need those plants operating at their minimum load. As Daniel was mentioning before, those plants are trying to operate at lower and lower levels, which is great, so that we can make better use of solar in the middle of the day. But we are in a process of making sure that we can operate the power system successfully over time to make sure that we can minimise the types of things that would be emergency actions, but we also always need to make sure we've got security constrained dispatch, which means that the power system is in a secure state to be able to withstand a contingency that might occur, because it's a real-time power system and that can occur at any time.
Thank you. It sounds like there's a range of considerations. My question was about whether you've done a risk and probability analysis, and I'm interested, has any of that been made public, and can you provide it on notice?
So we have done some risk work around what are the elements that would need to be provided. We've actually been working on some of that internally, and we are looking to provide that, but we can certainly look to provide that work to this committee.
And quite a lot of that is contained within the annual reports that we do for system strength, inertia, and I can't remember what NSCAR stands for, but some more technical engineering documents that do get published in December each year. So we can certainly undertake to provide those.
Okay. And just finally, thank you, Chair. Won't dynamic operating envelopes be able to be used to curtail solar?
Sorry, could you just say that again?
Dynamic operating envelopes.
Yes.
Can't they be used to curtail solar? Why is a separate mechanism needed? Ms. York, you talked about that these technologies are of the future, but I talk to people in this space and it's there now. It's ready to go.
Yeah, if I just talk about dynamic operating envelopes, which we work with the distribution companies who are implementing those on their system, I guess the way we understand that dynamic operating envelopes is really to make sure that the maximum amount of solar rooftop can be fed out into the distribution network. So that's actually a way to make sure when there is the dynamics of the system would allow more. So that might be not at those times of minimum system load, but at other times where there's a lot more load on the system and the system is in a more stable state generally, so we've got more of those system security services available during the variations during the day, those dynamic operating envelopes can kick in to allow even more to be fed into the distribution system and up onto the transmission system. So the backstop curtailment is really at this minimum load part where if that's something that's occurring, and it's usually in the spring and autumn times when demand is lower and solar radiation is beautiful and at very high levels. And so we're really looking at, in those particular circumstances where we're at minimum load, we've got all the coal plants down or synchronous plants down at minimum load, what is the thing that will actually be a backstop mechanism to be able to make sure that we're not going to get into an insecure state? Dynamic operating envelopes will help in all of the rest of the time to maximise the amount of solar, rooftop solar that will be able to be fed out into the system. So they're a really important part of maximising the opportunity from solar rooftop.
Thank you, Ms York.
I'll chuck some more notes about the envelope. Thank you.
Just passing the call to Senator Dunningham, who's online.
Thanks, Chair. Can you hear me there?
Yes.
Great, excellent. All right. Look, I think we've only got sort of 10 or so minutes or whatever left. I just wanted to, if I can, sort of go back over some of what I think others have asked. So AEMO can't provide guarantees on price for the reasons that have been outlined, which I understand. But I want to sort of go to how government targets shape the work of AEMO with regard to the ISP. So, like, So, how does that work in broad terms? Can you just quickly step me through that?
Can I just check I understand the question? So, is it that how do we get from the target statement to what we actually do in the
yes,
ISP?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
What we do in terms of the target statement is take all that as an input and then work through what do we do with that, particularly in that first year of the 2-year cycle where we're looking at inputs, assumptions and scenarios. So if we take how do we get to net zero by 2050 as kind of a top line, we then take that as at what pace would we have across the different scenarios. So we have our 3 scenarios. One is a slower pace, one is a really ambitious pace, and one is middle of the road. And that's really taking what are global emissions reductions that would meet net zero by 2050, what are the temperature outlooks that might apply in terms of what temperature rise could be delivered with the different pace of change, and then what does that mean in terms of applying a different carbon budget to those different scenarios, which then really dictates what is the pace at which those things will occur. We also then look at how will we take into account other policies. So it might be a policy around res development in New South Wales. What does that mean in terms of generation mix that we put in different places? How do we think about emissions reduction targets of the different states? How do we contribute? How will they contribute to the different arrangements in terms of generation supply? Will you take into account land use planning, land usage, demand outlooks, consumer resources that we were just talking about in terms of rooftop solar, and feed all of that into our inputs, assumptions and scenarios? We then run what we call a supply-side model, looking at, well, if this is the demand or consumption side of things, what is the generation that's required? How do you meet the carbon budget? And are we meeting all of the targets, and go back and do a check that we're meeting all of those various emissions reduction targets from the various states that are in the assumptions? If it's something like the offshore wind policy that's in Victoria, we will make sure that I think it's 2 gigawatts by 2032, is actually in the mix of the supply side in 2032, and so on with the other specific targets that the jurisdictions have around particular types of renewable generation or storage targets or other things that are in the target statement.
So on that then, just with respect to coal, and I think it was touched on before, I mean, you've got asset owners and state governments working together, and there's, underwriting of coal assets to prolong life which then I think puts the ISP at odds with reality. I mean, how do you factor that in? How do you deal with that divergence?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So the emissions reduction is what largely drives coal, the profile of coal closures. So you will see a different profile in the slower pace of change, the middle of the road, and the more ambitious pace of change. And that's really because to meet that pace of change, you have to reduce the emissions in the modelling. You have to reduce the emissions faster to meet the different pace of change that's in the various scenarios. We will then just prepare information about how that might be different to the announced retirements or other arrangements that various state governments might have with coal plants, which are not an input unless they're something that we are given as a policy that we would need to include.
So are these inputs, so they're not binding, it is to a degree, and perhaps it's the wrong word, a matter of discretion for AEMO to take in what policy inputs and what government jurisdictions are doing across the country as to how it guides what the ISP looks like?
The inputs in the target statement are a must. We must consider those.
Right.
If they're not listed in the target statement, like a particular agreed date with a jurisdiction about closure of a coal plant, then that is not an input we must take into account. And across the various pace of change to meet the emissions reduction and the net zero by 2050, then we will look to what do we need to do in terms of emissions reduction to actually meet that pace of change.
Yes, we should also probably just outline that there are, in terms of the government policy that does get included outside of the emissions, outside of the target statement, there's a set of criteria by which if they meet, I'm going to say 2 of those criteria.
If any
of those criteria, then they are included.
They are included. Okay, so this probably takes me to where I was going to go. So I think on page 4. Page 4 of the 2025 Inputs Assumption Scenario Report consultation, it says the AEMO state that as required under the National Electricity Rules, for the ISP's purposes, all scenarios in the scenario collection apply relevant policies that meet public policy criteria, including international commitments such as the Paris Agreement, and legislative policies that are quantifiable with AEMO's modelling scopes. And then on the page 13 of that document, it says, the same document, it says AEMO is bound by the NER to consider policies that meet the relevant public policy criteria. But then I think, and this is what I'm trying to understand here, I'm trying to reconcile that with what the National Electricity Rules actually say, where they state that paragraph B under the rules, it says, in determining power system needs and in determining how integrated system plan would contribute to achieving the national electricity objective in relation to participating jurisdictions, AEMO, 1, must consider, and that was what I think was being referred to before, the emissions reductions targets stated in the target statements, and 2, may consider, and so there's a degree of discretion here, a current environment or energy policy of a participating jurisdiction, and it goes through emissions reductions targets, which is not set out in the target statement, where policy has been sufficiently developed to enable AEMO to identify the impacts, etc. And it goes through those, I think, what you were referring to as the any categories. The 1, a commitment that has been made to an international agreement. B, 2, policies been enacted in legislation. 3. So I want to know, does AEMO interpret the requirement to consider these targets as an injunction that these targets must bind all scenarios?
Well, certainly in the target statement, which was issued when the NEO was amended, and I'm just not 100% sure of the exact date. Since that has been in place, that only came into the National Electricity Rules when the NEO was amended to include emissions and the target statement was published. So since that time, Anything that's in the target statement we must take into account. Prior to that, it was only the second part of those, with those criteria, that guided what we take into account. Then we would consider whether any of those criteria had been met as to whether we would make that as a binding input into the IASR process. And we would consult on that. So we would provide in the draft IASR an indication of what we thought we needed to do based on whether there's an international commitment, whether there is legislation, etc. And we would then consult on that and then make that definitive statement in the final IASR.
Sure, okay. I just want to I could go on a bit more about how the ISP is sort of developed and how, some of these targets are missed and therefore scenarios don't properly take them into account perhaps. But I just more broadly would be keen to understand why emissions seems to get a much higher level of importance applied to it than cost in terms of the ISP. I mean, has there ever been a decision actively taken to place emissions higher than cost of production or cost to the consumer of energy?
I think the way that we apply the ISP framework is in that scenario basis. We're looking at if the goal is to get to net zero by 2050, which all Australian states had committed to, it's then about the pace at which that target of net zero by 2050 is achieved, and what is then the lowest cost pathway to achieve that across a range of pace of that. And what we're really looking for is a robust plan as to if you go slower, what is the least cost path? If you go, if there's really ambition about meeting that very quickly, what is the lowest cost pathway? And looking for what is the robust set of developments that are required to meet those targets at the least cost within that framework.
And perhaps just to add to that, the primacy of the integrated system plan is about providing secure and reliable electricity to consumers. It's not a primacy of emissions. This is about reliable and secure electricity, and then within a set of quite tightly prescribed guardrails that are outlined in, I think it's 20 pages of rules.
Yeah, but the point was just made that the goal, according to all of the jurisdictions, is to reach net zero by a point in time, and then that goal being set, figure out how to do that with a consideration to cost after that. So, that to me sounds like we've got to reach that goal and then we'll figure out how, it's not about a dollar value, but how you might do that in the least cost way. That is clear to me. Chair, I have no further questions.
Thank you. You're bang on time, Senator Duniam. As you can tell, there's a huge amount of interest in having AEMO before us. We have a range of witnesses appearing next week, some of which, from the submissions I'm going to flag, potentially might make some not adverse findings, make some assessments of your work that you may wish to come back at a later time and address. So if that's suitable to you, we'll try and find another time to get you back. In the meantime, any questions on notice are due back by 2 weeks. 2 weeks today. And obviously any members who wish to put any questions on notice are able to put them to you as well. So look out for those.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Senators.
Thank you very much. We're going to adjourn now. We'll return from lunch at 2 p.m. But if I could just keep the members here very briefly for a very quick private meeting, please.